Imagine this. You are a Spanish palace physician in the year 1829, your hands trembling as you adjust the strange silk cushion on the royal bed. The young queen, Maria Cristina, barely 19, sits terrified in the corner while her uncle husband, King Ferdinand VII, paces naked before you. His grotesquely oversized member swings between his legs like a club, thin as sealing wax at its base, but thick as a man's fist at its bulbous tip. Your medical training never prepared you for this. 4 wives have already failed to produce an heir for Spain's most despised monarch. 3 of them died young and childless. Now the kingdom's survival depends on your ability to devise a way for this anatomical monstrosity to function normally. The cushion you've created must support the impossibly narrow base while allowing only the massive head to remain functional. One mistake, and you'll join the countless others who have disappeared into Ferdinand's dungeons. What you don't know is that this bizarre medical intervention will determine the entire future of Spain. The cushion you're adjusting will prevent a civil war, reshape European politics, and allow one of history's most twisted rulers to finally produce the heir that his anatomical deformity had made nearly impossible. But the true horror of Ferdinand VII extends far beyond his physical grotesqueness into realms of betrayal, cruelty, and systematic oppression that make his anatomical abnormality seem almost quaint by comparison. Think medieval kings were bad. Think modern dictators represent the worst of human evil. Ferdinand VII of Spain perfected a level of systematic betrayal and intimate perversion that makes contemporary villains look like amateur sociopaths. This is the story of a man whose penis was so bizarrely shaped that it required medical intervention to function, whose 4 marriages to his own nieces and cousins created a trail of traumatized women and dead infants, and whose reign of terror destroyed Spain's empire while satisfying his own twisted appetites for power and revenge. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten nightmare of European royalty, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truth of history, consider hitting that subscribe button. These buried voices from the past deserve to be heard, and there are so many more shocking stories waiting to be told. You're helping preserve these testimonies by staying connected to this journey through history's darkest corners. The physical reality of Ferdinand VII's condition was documented by horrified court physicians and scandalized foreign observers. A French writer who witnessed the king's anatomy described it with clinical precision that reveals the true scope of the problem. The royal member was as long as a billiard cue, thin as a stick of sealing wax at its base, and as fat as a fist at its extremity. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. This was medical documentation of a condition so severe that normal intimate relations were physically impossible. But here's where Ferdinand's story becomes truly disturbing. In an era when large endowments were considered monstrous rather than desirable, following Greek ideals of physical perfection, Ferdinand's condition was viewed as a deformity that marked him as fundamentally unfit for kingship. The Spanish court whispered that his grotesque anatomy was divine punishment for the evil in his soul. They weren't wrong about the evil, but the deformity was likely the result of generations of royal inbreeding that had finally produced its most twisted fruit. The medical solution devised by court physicians reveals the desperate lengths to which 19th century Spanish medicine would go to preserve royal succession. A specially designed silk cushion had to support the impossibly narrow base of Ferdinand's organ, leaving only the bulbous tip available for intimate contact. This apparatus, stored today in the Prado Museum's archives, represents one of history's most bizarre medical devices, created not for health, but for political necessity. Ferdinand's first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, discovered her husband's condition on their wedding night in 1802. The sight of his naked body sent her into such terror that she fled screaming from the bedchamber, refusing to return for days. When she finally submitted to consummation, the experience was so traumatic that she required the intervention of ladies-in-waiting to prevent her from fleeing the palace entirely. The marriage produced 2 brief pregnancies that ended in miscarriages, likely due to the physical trauma of intimate relations with Ferdinand's deformed anatomy. Maria Antonia died mysteriously in 1806 at only 21 years old. Rumors immediately spread that her mother had poisoned her to end her daughter's suffering. Rumors that gained credibility when the palace apothecary committed suicide and left behind a confession letter that Spanish authorities immediately seized and never released. Whether murder or mercy-killing, Maria Antonia's death freed her from a marriage that had become a form of ongoing torture. Ferdinand's second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, was also his niece, continuing the incestuous pattern that had likely created his deformity in the first place. Unlike his first wife, Maria Isabel proved as cruel and power-hungry as Ferdinand himself, encouraging his absolutist tendencies and his systematic destruction of Spain's constitutional government. Their shared sadism extended to their intimate life, where Maria Isabel apparently found ways to accommodate Ferdinand's anatomical challenges through practices that contemporary observers described only in veiled terms that suggested extreme sexual behaviors. The couple managed to produce one daughter who survived birth but died at only 5 months old. A second daughter died during childbirth, ending any hope that this branch of the marriage would produce a male heir. Maria Isabel died in 1818 from complications of yet another failed pregnancy, leaving Ferdinand again widowed and still without the son that Spanish succession law required. Ferdinand's third wife, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, represents perhaps the most tragic of his victims. Raised by nuns and possessing an extreme religious devotion, the 16-year-old princess was completely unprepared for marriage to a man whose anatomy would have challenged even experienced women. On their wedding night in 1819, Ferdinand entered her chamber completely naked, expecting normal relations. Maria Josepha's reaction was so extreme that she not only fled screaming, but actually soiled herself from terror before consummation could occur. The trauma of that first encounter created lasting psychological damage that made all subsequent intimate contact a form of torture for both participants. Maria Josepha became convinced that any sexual activity, even within marriage, violated Catholic doctrine. It required a personal letter from Pope Pius VII himself to convince her that marital relations were not sinful. And even then, she insisted on praying extensively before each encounter. Despite the Pope's intervention and the medical cushion that made physical relations technically possible, Ferdinand and Maria Josepha never produced children. The marriage became a grim exercise in duty, with the young queen submitting to her husband's grotesque anatomy while praying for death. Her prayers were answered in 1829 when she died of fever at only 25, making Ferdinand's third wife to die young and childless. Here's what makes Ferdinand's story transcend mere gossip about royal anatomy and enter the realm of systematic evil. His physical deformity was just one manifestation of a personality so twisted that it poisoned everything he touched. Born in 1784 as the eldest son of King Charles and Maria Luisa of Parma, Ferdinand grew up in a court where his mother openly conducted an affair with Manuel Godoy, the prime minister, while his father ignored both his kingdom and his family. Ferdinand's hatred for his parents, especially his mother, festered into a consuming rage that would later poison his entire reign. Excluded from government by Godoy, who saw him as a threat, Ferdinand began plotting against his own family while still in his teens. His tutor, recognizing the prince's capacity for treachery, encouraged him to reach out to Napoleon Bonaparte, Spain's most dangerous enemy, in a bid to overthrow his own father. The El Escorial conspiracy of 1807 revealed the full extent of Ferdinand's treachery. At only 23, he was actively plotting with French agents to betray his own country to Napoleon in exchange for power. When the conspiracy was discovered, Charles IV was forced to arrest his own son for treason. The discovery that the heir to the Spanish throne was willing to sell out his country to foreign invaders shattered what remained of the Bourbon dynasty's credibility. Ferdinand's arrest for treason against his own father provided Napoleon with the perfect opportunity to destroy Spain from within. The French emperor recognized that Ferdinand's combination of ambition and stupidity made him the ideal puppet ruler. Napoleon invited the entire Spanish royal family to a meeting in Bayonne, where he forced both Ferdinand and his father to abdicate in favor of Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte. What happened next reveals Ferdinand's true character. Rather than resisting French domination or maintaining any dignity in captivity, Ferdinand spent the next 6 years at the Château de Valençay writing fawning letters to Napoleon, congratulating him on his victories against Spanish resistance fighters and begging to be adopted as one of Napoleon's sons. Historian Michael Glover observed that the Spanish Bourbons never sank lower than this, but Ferdinand's collaboration with France while Spanish patriots died fighting for his restoration was just the beginning of his betrayals. The Spanish people, unaware of Ferdinand's cowardice and collaboration, fought one of history's bloodiest wars of independence to restore their beloved king. The Peninsular War from 1808 to 1814 devastated Spain, with guerrilla fighters employing brutal tactics against French occupiers, while Ferdinand lived comfortably in French luxury, betraying every secret he knew about Spanish resistance to his captors. When Napoleon's empire finally collapsed and Ferdinand was released in 1813, he returned to a Spain that had been transformed by war and sacrifice. The Cortes of Cadiz had written a liberal constitution that limited royal power and established basic rights for Spanish citizens. The people who had fought and died to restore Ferdinand expected him to honor the constitutional system they had created in his name. Ferdinand's response to the constitution that had been written by his loyal subjects reveals the depths of his betrayal. On March 24, 1814, just 6 weeks after returning to Spain, he tore up the constitution and arrested the liberal leaders who had fought for his restoration. The man they had called El Deseado, the desired one, immediately became El Rey Felon, the criminal king. The systematic oppression that followed Ferdinand's restoration makes his anatomical problems seem almost irrelevant by comparison. He reinstated the Spanish Inquisition, closed universities, eliminated freedom of the press, and launched a reign of terror against anyone who had supported constitutional government. Political prisoners filled Spanish jails while public executions became regular entertainment, designed to terrorize the population into submission. Ferdinand's reign destroyed Spain's remaining credibility as a European power. His refusal to accept any limits on royal authority provoked constant rebellions that he suppressed with increasing brutality. The army that had liberated Spain from French occupation was purged of officers with liberal sympathies, replaced by thugs and sycophants whose only qualification was absolute loyalty to Ferdinand's paranoid regime. The loss of Spain's American empire during Ferdinand's reign was the direct result of his authoritarian incompetence. When liberal revolutions broke out across Spanish America, Ferdinand's response was to send inadequate armies led by incompetent commanders to suppress independence movements that had been inspired partly by the same liberal ideals that Ferdinand was crushing in Spain itself. Simón Bolívar, who had met Ferdinand personally at court, later described the Spanish king as embodying everything wrong with European monarchy. The future liberator of South America had witnessed Ferdinand's arrogance and stupidity firsthand, experiences that strengthened his resolve to free the New World from Spanish rule. By 1826, Spain had lost virtually its entire American empire, retaining only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The economic consequences of Ferdinand's rule were catastrophic. Spain's treasury, already depleted by the Peninsular War, was further drained by Ferdinand's expensive security apparatus and his lavish court spending. The loss of American silver meant that Spain could no longer finance its government through colonial exploitation. But Ferdinand refused to consider the economic reforms that might have restored Spanish prosperity. Ferdinand's paranoia created a climate of terror that destroyed Spain's intellectual and cultural life. Writers, artists, and thinkers fled the country or disappeared into prison cells. The universities that had made Spain a center of learning were closed or reduced to teaching only subjects that supported absolute monarchy. Spain, which had been a major European power for 3 centuries, became a backward police state under Ferdinand's rule. The systematic nature of Ferdinand's oppression extended to the most intimate aspects of Spanish life. His secret police monitored private conversations, intercepted personal letters, and encouraged citizens to inform on their neighbors. Attendance at Mass was mandatory, but even religious devotion was suspect if it didn't explicitly support the king's absolute authority. Ferdinand's court became a nest of corruption and depravity, where advancement required absolute submission to the king's twisted whims. Courtiers competed to demonstrate their loyalty through increasingly degrading acts of sycophancy, while Ferdinand used his power to indulge in behaviors that combined political sadism with intimate perversion. The king's treatment of his own wives reveals how his political cruelty extended into his private life. Each marriage was arranged to serve Ferdinand's dynastic needs, with no consideration for the women who became his victims. The pattern of marrying close relatives continued the inbreeding that had likely caused Ferdinand's anatomical deformity, while creating intimate relationships based on domination and fear rather than any human connection. Contemporary observers noted that Ferdinand seemed to take pleasure in his wife's suffering, both physical and psychological. His insistence on intimate relations despite the medical challenges his anatomy created suggests a sadistic enjoyment of inflicting pain. The special cushion that made consummation technically possible became a symbol of Ferdinand's ability to force others to accommodate his twisted needs regardless of the cost to them. Ferdinand's inability to produce a male heir through his first 3 marriages created a succession crisis that threatened to tear Spain apart. His brother Carlos, even more reactionary than Ferdinand himself, positioned himself as the next king while Ferdinand desperately sought medical solutions to his fertility problems. The pressure to produce an heir drove Ferdinand to increasingly desperate measures, including consulting with practitioners of sexual magic and purchasing supposed fertility enhancers from across Europe. The marriage to his 4th wife, Maria Cristina of the 2 Sicilies, in 1829 represented Ferdinand's last chance to secure the succession. At 45, he was no longer young, and his health was declining from years of excess and stress. Maria Cristina, only 19 and reportedly chosen partly because she had already given birth in a previous relationship, was expected to provide the son that 3 previous wives had failed to produce. The successful use of the medical cushion that allowed Ferdinand to impregnate Maria Cristina represents one of history's strangest interventions of technology in royal succession. Without this bizarre medical device, Ferdinand would have died childless. His brother Carlos would have inherited the throne, and Spanish history would have followed a completely different path. The cushion that enabled consummation was literally a turning point in European politics. Maria Cristina gave birth to Isabella in 1830, followed by another daughter in 1832. The birth of daughters rather than sons created new problems for Ferdinand, who was forced to change Spanish succession law to allow his daughter Isabella to inherit the throne. This decision, embodied in the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, set the stage for the Carlist Wars that would devastate Spain after Ferdinand's death. Ferdinand's final years were marked by increasing desperation to secure his daughter's succession against the claims of his brother Carlos. He was forced to seek support from the very liberals he had persecuted throughout his reign, creating a temporary alliance between the monarchy and constitutional forces against the ultra-conservative Carlists who supported Carlos. The physical and moral corruption that defined Ferdinand's reign culminated in his death on September the 29th, 1833. His final weeks were reportedly marked by hallucinations and paranoid rages, as his diseased body finally succumbed to the poisons he had been ingesting, both literally and figuratively, throughout his life. Court physicians noted that his deformed anatomy had become increasingly problematic as he aged, with infections and other complications creating constant pain. Ferdinand's death at 49 left Spain in chaos. His daughter Isabella, not yet 3 years old, inherited a throne contested by her uncle Carlos and his supporters. Maria Cristina, as regent, was forced to ally with liberals and constitutionalists to defend her daughter's claim, ironically embracing the very political forces that Ferdinand had spent his reign trying to destroy. The Carlist wars that followed Ferdinand's death lasted intermittently until 1876, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and completing the economic and social destruction that Ferdinand had begun. Spain's decline from major European power to peripheral backwater was the direct result of Ferdinand's combination of personal depravity and political incompetence. Here's what makes Ferdinand VII's story more than just another tale of royal perversion and cruelty. His reign represents the perfect storm of personal evil and institutional decay that can destroy an entire civilization. Ferdinand's anatomical deformity, bizarre as it was, reflected the deeper corruption of a dynasty that had rotted from within through generations of inbreeding and moral decay. The special cushion that allowed Ferdinand to produce an heir became a symbol of the extraordinary measures required to preserve institutions that had lost all moral authority. Spanish monarchy survived Ferdinand's reign only through technological intervention that enabled the perpetuation of a bloodline that should have ended with his sterility. The kingdom would have been better served if his anatomical problems had prevented any reproduction at all. Ferdinand's systematic betrayal of everyone who trusted him reveals a level of evil that transcends ordinary villainy. He betrayed his country to Napoleon, betrayed the patriots who fought for his restoration, betrayed the wives who submitted to his grotesque demands, and betrayed the Spanish people who called him their desired king. Each betrayal compounded the others until Ferdinand became a perfect embodiment of treachery. The international implications of Ferdinand's reign extended far beyond Spain's borders. His alliance with reactionary forces across Europe helped create the Holy Alliance system that suppressed liberal movements throughout the continent. Ferdinand's example of successful counter-revolution encouraged other absolute monarchs to reject constitutional limitations, contributing to the political instability that would plague Europe throughout the 19th century. Ferdinand's impact on Spanish America was equally devastating. His refusal to accept colonial autonomy or constitutional limits on royal power drove independence movements that might otherwise have resulted in peaceful transitions to dominion status within a reformed Spanish empire. Instead, Ferdinand's absolutist policies ensured that Spanish America would break away through violent revolution, creating the political instability that has plagued Latin America ever since. The cultural and intellectual damage that Ferdinand inflicted on Spain took generations to repair. His systematic destruction of educational institutions, suppression of free thought, and persecution of intellectuals created a dark age of Spanish learning that coincided with rapid scientific and technological advancement in other European countries. Spain's isolation from European intellectual development during Ferdinand's reign contributed to its inability to compete economically or militarily with more progressive nations. Ferdinand's treatment of women, both wives and subjects, reflects the broader brutalization of Spanish society under his rule. His insistence on intimate relations that caused physical and psychological trauma to his wives established a pattern of institutional cruelty that extended to his treatment of political prisoners, religious minorities, and anyone who challenged his authority. The medical records of Ferdinand's anatomical condition, preserved in Spanish royal archives, provide unique insight into how physical deformity can compound moral corruption. Ferdinand's awareness of his grotesque appearance and functional limitations apparently increased his sadistic tendencies, as if inflicting suffering on others compensated for his own physical inadequacies. Contemporary European observers noted that Ferdinand's reign represented everything wrong with absolute monarchy in an age of democratic awakening. Foreign diplomats reported that Spain under Ferdinand had become a police state where arbitrary imprisonment, torture, and execution were routine instruments of government. The contrast between Spain's oppression and the constitutional progress of countries like Britain and France highlighted the bankruptcy of Ferdinand's political system. The tragedy of Ferdinand's Spain was that alternative paths were available, but deliberately rejected. The Constitution of 1812 provided a framework for constitutional monarchy that could have preserved royal authority while establishing basic rights and representative government. Ferdinand's decision to destroy this constitution in favor of absolute rule doomed Spain to decades of civil war and political instability. Ferdinand's personal relationships with his ministers and courtiers reveal a pattern of manipulation and psychological abuse that mirrors his treatment of his wives. He deliberately created competition among his advisors, rewarding treachery and punishing competence to ensure that no one could threaten his absolute control. This systematic destruction of effective governance created the administrative chaos that characterized Ferdinand's entire reign. The economic policies of Ferdinand's government were designed primarily to extract resources for the king's personal use rather than promote national prosperity. His refusal to consider modern fiscal reforms or economic development programs reflected his view of the Spanish state as his personal property to be exploited for his own benefit. Ferdinand's manipulation of religious sentiment to justify his oppressive policies represents one of history's most cynical uses of faith for political purposes. His restoration of the Inquisition and persecution of religious minorities had nothing to do with genuine piety and everything to do with creating a climate of terror that made resistance seem both hopeless and sinful. The international isolation that resulted from Ferdinand's domestic policies weakened Spain's position in European diplomacy and contributed to the loss of its remaining global influence. Other European powers found Ferdinand personally repugnant and politically unreliable, making meaningful alliances impossible and leaving Spain vulnerable to foreign interference. Ferdinand's legacy of institutional destruction continued to poison Spanish politics long after his death. The Carlist Wars, the Second Republic, the Spanish Civil War, and the Franco dictatorship can all be traced back to the political divisions and institutional weakness that Ferdinand created during his reign of terror. Here's the ultimate lesson of Ferdinand VII's twisted reign. Evil on this scale requires both personal depravity and institutional weakness. Ferdinand's anatomical deformity and moral corruption would have remained merely personal pathologies if Spanish institutions had been strong enough to constrain his power. Instead, the combination of absolute monarchy with a completely corrupted royal bloodline created the perfect conditions for one man's sickness to destroy an entire civilization. Modern democracies that take constitutional limits and institutional checks for granted should remember Ferdinand's example of how quickly civilized government can collapse when power becomes concentrated in the hands of someone whose personal pathologies override all moral constraints. The special cushion that enabled Ferdinand's reproduction represents the dangerous lengths to which institutions will go to preserve themselves even when preservation serves no legitimate purpose. The wives who suffered under Ferdinand's grotesque anatomy represent all the victims of political systems that treat human beings as instruments for the satisfaction of power rather than as individuals deserving of dignity and protection. Their pain was not incidental to Ferdinand's reign, but central to it, reflecting a worldview that saw suffering as the natural consequence of submission to absolute authority. Ferdinand II died as he had lived, surrounded by terror and corruption, leaving behind a legacy of institutional destruction that would haunt Spain for more than a century. His anatomical deformity, bizarre though it was, pales in comparison to the spiritual deformity that made him one of history's most completely evil rulers. The medical cushion that made Ferdinand's reproduction possible sits today in the Prado Museum as a reminder of the grotesque lengths to which human ingenuity will be employed in service of fundamentally corrupt purposes. It represents not medical progress, but moral regression, technological skill deployed to perpetuate suffering rather than alleviate it. Ferdinand's story reminds us that the capacity for systematic evil exists in every generation, and that institutional safeguards against tyranny require constant vigilance to maintain. His combination of personal pathology and political power created a reign of terror that destroyed one of Europe's great civilizations and left scars that persist to this day. The most perverted king in history was perverted not just in his anatomy, but in his soul. And the tragedy of his reign was not that he possessed power despite his deformities, but that Spanish institutions were too weak to prevent a monster from wielding that power without constraint. Ferdinand VII represents the ultimate warning about what happens when evil finds institutional expression and personal pathology becomes public policy. These voices from history remind us why understanding the past matters. If this exploration into the shadows of human experience has opened your eyes to hidden truths, subscribe to continue this journey together. There are countless more stories buried in history's archives, waiting for someone willing to listen. Click that subscribe button to ensure these forgotten testimonies reach others who seek to understand the full spectrum of human experience, from its highest achievements to its most depraved failures. The light that flickered over Ferdinand's special cushion as he attempted to fulfill his dynastic obligations represents the collision of medical necessity with moral bankruptcy, technological innovation with institutional decay. In that moment, we see not just the grotesque reality of one man's anatomical deformity, but the spiritual deformity of a system that would go to any lengths to preserve itself, regardless of the human cost.